This is the content presentation for the Week 5 readings for Psych 512, Social Psychology, and I'm Marcus Pollard, the presenter. This week we took our readings from the Social Psychology text by Cashin, Fine, and Marcus. Chapter 7 was called Conformity. Chapter 8 was called Group Processes. We also looked at the journal articles, Reese and Wallace, The Myth of Conformity, Adolescence, and Abstention from Unhealthy Drinking Behaviors. We are also reading the Hawley, Hosch, and Bovaird article, which has to do with exploring social identity theory and the black sheep effect among college student athletes and non-athletes. So the first chapter we read, chapter 7 on conformity, had the section Social Influence is Automatic, which just discussed the general reality of how easily people are drawn from their individuality into conformity with larger groups. One of the things that's mentioned is the chameleon effect, whereby a tester, simply by touching their faces or moving their heads, could get the people being tested to adopt the same behavior. There's a section on conformity, which is described as the tendency to change our perceptions, opinions, or behavior in ways that are consistent with group norms. This is common as we enter into in-groups, part of fitting into the in-group and also making the in-group, enabling the in-group to function more smoothly. So what's described there, among other things, is informational vis-a-vis normative conformity. Informational conformity being about adopting the attitudes found in the in-group. Normative conformity about conforming one's words and deeds. And those kinds of conformity go hand in hand with public and private conformity, which public conformity being the words and the deeds, so that the group can function more smoothly, but also then the interior adoption, both of the ideas, but also the values that are found in the in-group. And there was a section on compliance, which is defined as changes in behavior that are elicited by direct requests. And part of what that section pointed to is the ease with which, if one knows in effect which buttons to push, how people can be drawn from or drawn into engaging in behaviors that otherwise they wouldn't want to, or spend money they wouldn't want to, and yet through different techniques, step by step, they can be brought into behavior at the behest of another person. Finally, more overtly, there's the reality of obedience, which is defined as behavior change produced by the commands of authority. And probably there the most dramatic discussion is about the Milgram experiment, where ordinary people were, by virtue of the circumstances and the commands they were given, led to cause what they thought was an enormous amount of pain to other people. And the whole experiment generated a lot of discussion about the danger of ordinary people being drawn into cruelty without consciously choosing it at the front end. And the chapter ended with a discussion on what's called the continuum of social influence, where there was a search for an overarching theory of how conformity, compliance, and obedience occur. And there was identified was what's called social impact theory, the theory that social influence depends on the strength, immediacy, and number of source persons relative to the target person. So the reality of conformity doesn't simply occur randomly, but by virtue of who one is being affected by in an in-group or in a larger group or in an experimental setting, people can be directly influenced, again, whether they may or may not be aware of it, into conforming with another group, such that hopefully the behavior is beneficial, but the behavior can also be actually cruel and evil. Chapter 8 in the text is called Group Processes, and it looks at how group dynamics function, where it's individuals in the group can interact with the group in such a way, both for the benefit and the detriment of the group. It begins with a section called Fundamentals of Groups, including the definition that a group is a set of individuals who interact over time and have a shared fate, goals, or identity. And fundamental throughout, I mean, the very nature of the course is a discussion about how individuals interact with groups and groups interact with them. So the next section in the chapter entitled Individuals in Groups, the Presence of Others, looks at the process whereby the presence of others enhances the performance on easy tasks, but can impair the performance in difficult tasks. This is called social facilitation. So the presence of other people does affect how well or poorly other people perform, and it depends upon both their presence and the nature of the activities that they're involved in. This then leads into the section on group performance, which describes both problems and solutions to how group performance can benefit from and be harmed by the presence of other people. So specifically, there is whether group performance losses or gains, the reduction or increase of group performance is due to the factors of the dynamics in the group, such that they will either underperform or outperform compared to the work of the collection of individuals who would work by themselves. So in this section, among other things, there was the discussion of groupthink. There was the discussion about how well or poorly the expertise of individuals can be brought into the decision-making and the work of a group. Here, unless members of a group are careful, easily group activities can be less effective than the activities of individuals working on specific projects. And yet by the end of the section, it's the factors that are needed to take advantage of the members of a group is highlighted so that, process loss and underperformance don't have to occur. Finally, the chapter ends with a section called Conflict, Cooperation, and Competition Within and Between Groups. And in this regard, this chapter or this section looks at how groups interact with each other, almost like individuals will interact with one another. It doesn't have to occur, group dynamics don't have to be such that groups interacting with one another suffer losses. But unless there's effort made to find common ground, then the dilemmas that are described in the chapter unfortunately lead to groups not only being in competition with one another, but actually harming one another and harming the greater common good. So one of the two articles, the Rees-Wallace article, The Myth of Conformity, Adolescence, and Abstention from Unhealthy Drinking Behaviors, looks at the likelihood of nonconformity within a circle of drinking friends when an individual, whether a drinker or non-drinker, has a companion who is a non-drinker. So what they found in doing this study was that while individuals by themselves were vulnerable to the influence of the group of friends as a whole who are drinking, it's contrasted with how if there's simply a second individual in the group, it made it significantly easier for both of them to resist the social pressure to drink. So it didn't require equal numbers of drinkers and non-drinkers. All it took was one other person, and the ability to be and to not conform to the larger group was significantly facilitated. Along with that, it was also noteworthy that the presence of a smaller group of non-drinkers will influence the larger majority so that they are less likely to drink or will drink less themselves than if that small group of non-drinkers wasn't there with them. The next article that we read, the Hawley, Hosch, and Bovaird article called Exploring Social Identity Theory and the Black Sheep Effect in Among College Student Athletes and Non-Athletes. Here what we read about was the likelihood of the dynamics of social identity theory, which has to do with in-group favoritism versus out-of-group hostility, and what's called the black sheep effect, where there's a greater hostility within a group toward a non-conforming member of the in-group when the group identity is threatened by that same in-group member. And the question is, how much is that active within a community of college students, some of whom are athletes and some of whom are non-athletes? The assumption being that when the athletes or when the students looked at inappropriate behavior, some gross and some mild, that they would judge according the behavior that they saw according to in-group and out-group attitudes, or in-group and out-group dispositions. The results they found were really mixed, because generally the attitudes of the student athletes and non-athletes were really similar to each other toward other students who misbehaved, whether mildly or severely. So that didn't really fit with the social identity theory that they thought that they would find. What they did find, though, the anomaly is that the student athletes, in fact, were harsher in the treatment that they thought other student athletes should receive whose misbehavior was severe. So to that extent, there was some element of the black sheep effect. But the results being mixed, the study concluded that there really needed to be more work done to see what constituted in-group and out-group identity in college students. So the first thing that jumped out at me in looking over sort of the whole scope of the readings from the texts and also the journal articles was what I'd mentioned before about the susceptibility of individuals to processes that cause conformity of the individuals within a group. So it's mentioned in the text everything from just the simple reality of social influence that looks at the whole study of the ways people are affected. Interesting that not by real pressures, but also imagined pressures of others. And then examples of that, the conformity, the informational and the normative, and the public and the private. How much simply the presence of majority attitudes and customs can affect minority members of a group. So without even thinking about it, they naturally would conform themselves. There's the horrifying extreme of the Milgram experiment. There's the subtlety and the seduction of the traps that could be set that the text describes as ways of, in effect, seducing people into engaging behavior that, if it were simply presented simply, they would never do so. So it was described as their foot in the door, simply by getting to engaging a person in a mild conversation, then you can get them to engage in larger activities because a rapport has been established. There's lowballing, creating the impression that something is you're going to get something, and then when that's changed, rather than backing out, people, will stay committed to a project even if it becomes more expensive or more difficult. There's the door in the face, where people are drawn into engaging in behaviors that are requested of them. There's the "that's not all folks" behavior, where that's almost like a bait and switch. Something is offered, and then there's more, and then there's more, and people get drawn into the reality of what's, without realizing, being drawn into committing more time and energy and money. And the whole section began with what's described, I talked about earlier, as the chameleon effect, where people, without even realizing, will just simply imitate each other's behaviors thoughtlessly, which all sort of pointed to just how susceptible we are to the influence of others. The next thing that popped out that seemed to be significant to me were the problems that can plague groups in the process of their decision making. There were three that were identified. One from what's described as brainstorming, where one would think that the collective ideas of a group of people would yield the results of gaining more wisdom, where instead what was found is that people didn't participate equally. Then there was also group polarization, where individuals, or where the group itself would, rather than seek the mean, it would take on the most extreme positions of the group and then also related to that was what was described as groupthink, where in this case, reasonable suggestions or reasonable ideas or information that the group is needed would be kept away from the decision-making process, so that the results that were arrived at were actually less reasonable and less thoughtful than if you had individuals working alone or working in smaller groups would have thought of or would have considered. These are all so common that businesses and governments, if they don't take steps, can find themselves thinking that by having the conformity and the harmony of members within a group, they actually function more effectively, when in point of fact, the text points out that they often function less effectively. The next theme that I was struck by was the reality that even with all of the social forces toward conformity, it was possible to rise above them. And so there was the example of the defiance of the Arab Spring in the Middle East in 2010 that spread over the Middle East, pushing back against despotic political leaders. There's the reality of the synchrony of behavior, whereby as individuals work with one another, small groups work with one another, their efforts are actually greater than simply the sum of their individual activities, but build on each other, which can be part of the force against a larger society, a larger group, larger culture. The assertiveness described, the vigilance needed so that one isn't pulled into the different activities whereby normal people, without being aware, are inclined to spend money, do things, get involved in activities that on their own they wouldn't want to, but can be in effect seduced into. And the reality of vigilance and being aware of those traps is the first step to avoiding them. And then the minority influence, described both in the Cashin text but also in the Rees and Wallace journal article, point to the power of small groups, individuals, minorities, pushing back against the larger forces in an in-group or against the majority, both in terms of reinforcing the ideas of the minority, but also actually affecting the behavior of the majority. And the last theme that I was particularly struck by, which isn't mentioned in any given place in the text, it's sort of alluded to throughout, though, is how much of the dynamics that are found through this study of conformity, how is it affected by social media? So the relationship between social media and group dynamics. So, for example, there is the kind of horrifying discovering from the Milgram experiment of how even up to 65% of the participants follow the orders by virtue of three factors: the authority figure, the proximity of victims, and the experimental procedure itself. And the question is, as people become increasingly disconnected from each other, and instead of having real relationships, they have virtual relationships. So one of the questions would be asked is, do those virtual relationships have the power to have the kind of influence to lead people to act in ways that really are antisocial and destructive? So in effect, what's the power there of the virtual relationship versus, something like the immediate physical presence needed in the Milgram experiment? Or based upon social impact theory, where the effect of the larger group on individuals has to do with strength, immediacy, and the number of sources. So again, the question is as people get disconnected from each other, the question that I would ask is that strength, immediacy, and number of sources, can that be experienced through social media? So it's not something that's explicitly discussed in the text, but it's alluded to. And since that's the direction of the culture toward people being disconnected from one another, it would seem apropos to just ask the question of, where virtual reality and social media are and how they're affecting people. In conclusion, I'd like to propose the following questions for your consideration. In light of the discussions in the text about resisting pressure to conform and being defiant in a group, and mirrored in the study about adolescent drinking. How might these findings be useful in living out Jesus' warning to the apostles in the missionary discourse, where he says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And the second question is, in addition, how might these findings be useful to assist parents in how they raise their children to deal with peer pressure from friends and acquaintances?